Hello, everyone. Welcome to our little study guide here. This is for your POLS 1010 final exam. Um, I have a plan here just to sort of go through the more picky or particular questions. I don't think the questions are going to be too challenging if you put the work in, and I hope this study guide will help you do that. I'm going to just focus on the questions that I think are more challenging. Right off the bat, you can see here I've circled a little typo here where it says the questions are based on theory, on logic. That's obviously supposed to be or logic, right? And that really speaks to the essential aspect of this study guide and the exam itself. I'm not really. Uh, I wouldn't say, rather, that too many of the questions here are going to be memorization questions. A lot of them are sort of going to be logical questions, and that means that you could sort of think yourself into a bit of a trap trying to sort of memorize things for them. I think because a lot of the questions are based on logic, you want to keep an open mind on what you're putting in those flashcards and how you're using your brain to study. Memorization might not be the best approach for some of these questions. I do strongly recommend flashcards, but really what you're trying to think of is the logic, the connective logic of some of these questions. And so understanding rather than memorization might be a better part of the approach. So try to keep that in mind as we go through the study guide here. And I'm not going to spend too much time on the memorization questions here. There are some, I'm not going to lie. Because it's a survey course, and obviously we know we need to. There are certain things we just need to know, but I'm going to spend my time in this study guide walkthrough, just talking about the more connective questions. So let's do that now. The study guide is pretty self-explanatory. It gives times, it gives contact information for how you should schedule your test. I know from talking to a few of you, a lot of you are booking for later in the week, so that's fine. Just to quickly sort of walk through some of the changes from the syllabus, because obviously we had a special lecture on Steve Bannon and Donald Trump and the rise of the alt-right. So in lieu of that, the sort of economic policy module of the course was dropped, and so consequently chapter 17 here that you can see is not going to be examined. But the things that are going to be examined, the 99% Occupy Wall Street collaborative film, I know that that's available on iTunes. For those of you who don't mind, there is a free version available, but I want to give a specific warning that this site, I'm genuinely not sure if it's legal or not. I haven't been able to verify that. It is available online though, for free. It just so happens that the site in question tends to use some choice images for advertising purposes, and so that may be disturbing for some people, certainly for some younger viewers. So if you are easily perturbed, then I do not suggest going to that site. But it is a way to, if you're concerned about revision for the film, it is a way for you to watch it for free. We're also going to be watching, we also did watch in class Ava Duvernay's documentary 13th, which is currently available on Netflix. If you don't have Netflix and you want to revise, or even if you want to just get the concrete points and want to skip watching it on Netflix, there are 2 articles linked here which kind of contain some of the key points. This is the second one, especially, is by Sean King, who's a great commentator on this sort of thing, great commentator on the Black Lives Matter movement. I think you'll be in good shape using that resource to prepare for the question as follows. And then, of course, I've put my lecture notes for week 13 on Steve Bannon and sort of tracing the line of conservative thinking from Edmund Burke to the rise of the alt-right, and asking this very simple question, as I did in my lecture. What would the founding father of conservatism, Edmund Burke, say today about the emergence of the alt-right and this sort of striving that the alt-right seems to be articulating for an ethnically pure or more homogenous, rather, maybe, culture in the United States, and from, of course, that basic principle, the alt-right expresses a very sort of strong argument about wanting to send all the Muslims home, all the illegal immigrants home, without sort of recognizing that the entire country is founded on, frankly, illegal immigration and the labor of immigrants. Many of them were forced to come here. The slaves, for example, are subjugated because they were already here, i.e. the Native Americans, who, if you think about it, I suppose, really ought to be the ones that are asking all the illegal immigrants to go home. Back to Europe, everyone, please. Unlikely to happen, I suppose, but if you carry the logic to its rational conclusions, it's almost unavoidable that you ask that question. Anyway, let's get right into it. We just have a few questions we want to go through here that are really going to maybe be the questions that you have questions for me about. So I'll try to preempt that here by going through them for you in this video. So how do mass movements differ? How are they different from interest groups? This goes back to our class on lobbying and also on the rise of mass movements. And they were, of course, we made clear that interest groups tend to sort of focus on insider lobbying, right? They go inside the beltway, they focus on influencing policymakers with a view to getting things done within the system and recognizing that the system is vertically integrated, that it has a hierarchy. Whereas mass movements today, and these days especially, probably since the 1970s onwards, if not the 1960s, have a sort of what we called in class a lowercase a anarchist predisposition. The anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, they tended to be quite horizontally organized. And what we mean by that is not just how they were, obviously they would have had some leadership, but they were, and the famous leaders, of course, include people like Martin Luther King, very charismatic individuals who could really articulate the values of the movement. But I think the sort of strategic goal for these movements, protest movements largely, has been to try not to reach upwards within the vertical hierarchy to influence the reins of power, but rather to influence the multitude, so to speak, the mass of citizens to change their minds, to rethink, to re-express, reimagine what democracy can be. I think that was really exemplified, for example, in the Occupy Wall Street movement, which brings me to question 4 here. Because they really express this in no uncertain terms, and you can see this in the documentary if you wanted to watch it again. It can be worth it just to see how this vision is expressed in the mouths of the participants and the observers of Occupy Wall Street. That their one demand was us, and the question is, what does that mean? Well, what they're asking for is a new us. They're not interested in making demands, and they didn't make demands of policymakers. They camped out on Wall Street and used that moment to create a sensation, to get media attention, to protest, and in some respects invite law enforcement to have to deal with them, creating a sensation and, in a sense, creating free advertising of a sort. And that free advertising effect was profoundly important, of course, because if you cast your mind back to 2012, it was the Occupy Wall Street movement that created the rhetoric of 99% versus the 1%. So when Mitt Romney famously had that video leak right in the middle of his presidential campaign that said 45% of Americans are lazy, they'll never vote for me because they don't know the meaning of a hard day's work, and Occupy Wall Street turned around and was like, dude, you just don't even understand. Like, since 2008, the financial crisis, we've been kicked out of our homes, we've had a foreclosure crisis. We were promised all these jobs if we worked hard and got our degrees, and here we are, finding we have no jobs. We've got degrees, but they're useless because we can't get the jobs that the degrees are for. Finding yourself in that situation and burdened by sometimes tens of thousands of dollars of debt with no career ahead of you, it's obviously a kind of it's a Swizz, right? I mean, the social promise, the social contract didn't get fulfilled. So that's what brought them out in the street, and the sort of recognition in the same breath that very, very easily the powers that be had seen fit to bail out the Wall Street banks who caused the crisis in the first place with their very relaxed attitude towards lending standards, very sort of selfishly lending to all manner of person without sufficient credit checks, knowing full well that because they were so big, this is the Matt Taibbi book, isn't it, that you've all been writing your book reviews on. They knew they were so big that that Eric Holder, the Obama's prosecutor, couldn't really take them to jail because it would have collapsed the U.S. economy. So, hence the expression "too big to jail." Not only too big to fail, but too big to jail. Obviously, that set people off, and so Occupy Wall Street stepped into that gap in the public discourse, and it said, we need to reinvent democracy. Clearly, this is if this is what democracy is producing, misery for the people who got sold out, and bailouts for the people who sold us out, with their tremendously huge lobbying budgets every year, and their massive influence on the politicians, then please, it's time for a rethink of the balance of power, the balance of forces within American democracy. Now, moving on to question 6, what's the elite democratic criticism of protest politics? Well, I think it's probably not hard to imagine, but if you're not going to express concrete demands of the people at the top, elite democratic criticism is going to be, well, you're kind of not demanding anything that we can help you with, right? So it's pointless to protest without concrete demands, and I suppose there's some truth to that in some ways. And the Occupy Wall Street guys would say, yeah, that's probably fair, but you're missing the point. The point is that it doesn't matter what we demand, because you're only ever going to listen to the Wall Street boys, right? Because they're the ones that pay for your political campaigns. They're the ones that pay for the TV adverts that you run every 4 years to try to get your guy elected to Congress, or to the presidency or whatever. So, it's pointless for us to try to make demands of you. You're going to ignore them anyway. What we really need to do is get people to vote differently, to get people to rethink, reimagine their role as citizens. So, interesting stuff about mass movement politics. Now, moving on to Congress, question 7. In an era of party decline, what do candidates for Congress do? If you remember, in an era of party decline, candidates, tend to be more... I'm trying to think of a way of saying this. They tend to be battle-hardened, right? They've worked their way up from the local level of politics to the state level of politics, and then on to national politics. So they've sort of self-selected, if that's the right term. They have figured out for themselves that they want a career in politics. Whereas in an era of party ascendancy, parties tend to be the ones that call the shots. They're the ones that tend to finance the candidates. You find people plucked up from relative obscurity who might have a good line or two and appear to be telegenic, and then suddenly they're plonked into a race that has massive advertising budgets provided by the parties. And so, many people are concerned then that the ascendancy of the parties, and of course the specific term, the technology, the technique, if you will, that the parties use within Congress is the whip. It's a metaphor, right? It's not a real whip, obviously. But the whip is the power of the vertical structure of the party to make demands of the candidates to toe the line on certain policies. In an era of party decline, candidates can be more diverse in their thinking. We discussed this on the day, if you remember, and we said that one of the real changes in the way political parties are run in this country is that once a time you'd have liberals and conservatives in the Republican Party and liberals and conservatives in the Democratic Party. The parties didn't necessarily have such tight alignment with their ideological values. Today, the parties are very sort of tightly run ships, and they the era that of where parties could um, um, permit such internal discourse seems to have passed. So congressmen today, because they don't have autonomy really to express their own views, and they're not in it for the political sort of idealism that they would have had in the past, tend to be more focused on just remaining in power, and what they think, their own sort of thoughts on politics, are less relevant because those thoughts don't get expressed so much in Congress. The parties dictate what they should say. So congressmen tend to spend this time focused on what they call the permanent campaign. Moving on, two questions that seem to be quite related: the question of the Iron Triangle and the question of congressional oversight. If you remember from the lecture, it's also discussed in good detail in the textbook. The Iron Triangle is a relationship between the congressman, or the executive, if you will, the congressmen, the bureaucrats of the executive branch, and the lobbyists. And the problem there is that specific policy solutions tend to get kind of hermetically sealed off from wider popular debate and popular oversight. A lot of this goes on behind closed doors. And the Iron Triangle basically means that you have a very sort of you have a trio of stakeholders, and the people aren't one of them. So congressional oversight is important to be the sort of opportunity that the people have to shine a light on these processes that are going on in these sort of closed door sessions of the Iron Triangle. Without Congress representing the people, or giving the people that sort of opportunity, you have a problem. You have a problem for democracy, and many people would argue that Congress has not been great because the parties have kind of hijacked the power process within Congress. That you don't have the kind of sort of historically famous moments of oversight that you would have had in the past. The U.S. Congressional history is full of these sort of moments where chairs of diverse committees would really kind of famously be on television throwing the book at industry, or at the executive branch for malfeasance or what have you, for ruining the environment, what have you. That day seems to be kind of ending, or have ended perhaps already, in an era of the Iron Triangles and the ascendance of the party. So I hope that's explanatory, and you can find more information on this in the textbook, but that's the basic gist of the relationship between those two questions. Very important that we understand that oversight is a kind of a counterbalance to the Iron Triangle, and if it's not there, we have a problem. So moving on, in the context of the modern presidency, in the context of the modern executive branch, not just in America, but in other countries too, like Great Britain, has the cabinet lost or gained power? Well, one, I'm not going to give you the answer to this, but of course one issue is that, the president doesn't necessarily like to have his only advisors to be in the cabinet, because the cabinet serves at the discretion of Congress. And if, Congress doesn't want a certain person to serve, that they don't serve. So because the president in a kind of technocratic society, a complex technocratic society, needs a lot of experts, and possibly prefers to have this expertise serving him without congressional oversight, then it makes sense that maybe the cabinet is going to be sidestepped. So that's, I feel, all I can say there without giving it away. But yeah, hopefully you've understood that. Another one that I think is really kind of misunderstood, and we talked about it a little bit in class, but the War Powers Resolution of 1973 did it rein in the powers of the presidency to engage in warfare overseas. This is around about the time Congress understood and discovered through the Pentagon Papers and other leaks that happened. Of course, WikiLeaks has the internet and is a relatively sort of huge scaled version of this. But there were leaks back in the 70s as well, before the internet, and the Pentagon Papers are a famous case study. The Congress responded with horror to the discovery that the U.S. armed forces had been engaging in illegal military or unsanctioned, unapproved military campaigns in countries that the country was not technically at war with. So the War Powers Resolution was an effort to rein in the office of the executive and to bring the power to declare war firmly back within Congress. And I suppose rhetorically it was symbolic, but has it been successful in its goal? I think the from Carter and Reagan onwards, it's been very clear that U.S. armed forces have been all too happy, sometimes through the auspices of the CIA, which, as you know, is a covert wing of the executive branch. Sometimes through the auspices of the Department of Defense. There's still been a lot of military campaigns, short term usually, but pretty violent all the same. Grenada, Panama, etc. So clearly the president's office continues to use armed forces without congressional approval on a regular basis. But Congress is complicit in that as well, as we were discussing in terms of the presidency. The OMF, the famous Authorization for Use of Military Force, being a case in point. Congress gave up a lot of power there, and it's clear that statute is being interpreted quite widely, quite broadly. Even today, President Obama still is adding terrorist organizations to the list of terrorist organizations that the U.S. can engage in military operations against, and claiming the approval of the OMF for those operations, even though the OMF specifically states that the power that it gives to the president is in order to prosecute organizations that were involved on September 11th, in the attacks of September 11th. Moving on a bit further, we had some interesting discussion about the Supreme Court. Some of these are kind of memorization questions, but the Warren Court question is interesting just because, it was one of those rare moments in U.S. history, in the long sweep of U.S. history, where we had a court that actually broke ranks with previous decisions and made a wide series of decisions that sort of benefited civil liberties and restrained the power of government to take away people's civil liberties. We had some discussion in lecture as to whether that was a common part of U.S. history, of the history of the Supreme Court, and indeed, of course, it isn't. When people talk about the battle between the textualists and the liberals, I imagine, if you remember the lecture, when you look at the amount of times that the so-called liberals have had power in the Supreme Court, it's actually been much more rarely than not. So the Warren Court was an exceptional court in that instance, in that sense. Moving along to Stone's footnote 4, an interesting case for us. This is where the court in the U.S. versus Carolyn Products Company started to argue that federal government could regulate the passage of civil liberties. And so, on the strength of these kinds of cases, it was a reversal. U.S. Carolyn Products and cases like it really were the cases that marked the reversal of a long history of the court having sort of ceded to the states the power to interpret the application of the Bill of Rights to their own taste and their own satisfaction. So federal government in Stone's footnote 4 deciding that or the Supreme Court rather deciding in Stone's footnote 4 that there was leverage, there was leeway for a greater role of federal government in guaranteeing the Bill of Rights and guaranteeing the political freedoms that would have stemmed from that. Then question 31, in the US, freedom of speech is not unlimited. Many Americans sort of hold up the idea of freedom of speech as unlimited. And of course, we know from our course that that's just not true. It's been especially true in relationship to civil rights because, obviously you can't go around, burning crosses on people's lawns and that kind of thing. Also, we know that fighting words are considered a type of speech that can be censored. But one of the first cases that really intervened, where the federal government really intervened in limiting the freedom of speech, was Schenck versus the United States, and the case decided in that instance on the merits of a claim about the threat to national security. That's just one clear area where the government does not give you unlimited freedom of speech, and your freedom of speech is not protected. Moving along, another couple of conceptually interesting questions. One is the question about prior restraint. This is to do, I'm not sure that we covered this in the lecture that day, but just in case, we'll just detail it now. The government can, of course, if necessary, censor printed matter. But what's really interesting is there's also a possibility that it can censor matter, printed matter, before the fact, i.e., before it's gone to the press. The government can call up the New York Times if it feels it has grounds to do so, and tell the New York Times not to run a story. It's controversial, but that's what prior restraint is. Roe versus Wade, upon what grounds did the Supreme Court strike down the existing laws on abortion? Hard not to sort of, I don't want to give away the answer to this one, frankly, but the basis of it was an argument about privacy, that helping a woman to have an abortion was arguably defensible under the Bill of Rights on the basis of privacy and due process, because to create an enforcement mechanism that would sanction women for having abortions would effectively make them second-class citizens to men, who, of course, are not subject to any surveillance in relation to this issue of what's going on within their bodies. And the court did articulate a need to balance between this right to a privacy and this need to give due care to the life of the unborn child. And so there was a compromise struck between these two rights, and that compromise prevails to this day, which is typically in and around the concept of what happens after the first trimester. So you do see in the reasoning of the various justices involved in Roe versus Wade a concern about needing to balance these rights. And so Roe versus Wade is the decision that where the Supreme Court at the federal level struck down existing state laws on abortion on the strength of these types of cases that we've just been talking about, Carolyn products, etc., where the federal government is deemed to have this power to guarantee the rights expressed in the Bill of Rights. Okay, now moving on to the documentary 13th that we watched in class. Just a little bit more that's very related to what we've just been talking about. You know, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution bans slavery, or does it? And so I've provided some materials for you. We were just discussing them earlier. They're linked earlier up above in this document if you want to check out the basis of that. But of course, this escape clause being one of the sort of many arguments, but one of the main causes for the huge scale of U.S. prisons. And of course, we're not saying that this escape clause in the 13th Amendment unilaterally causes there to be a massive complex of what's sometimes called the jail industrial complex, the prison industrial complex. But certainly it's a very major factor because these prisons, a lot of them provide cheap or free labor for industries in various localities. And that labor does not get paid, or if it gets paid very, very little, certainly not minimum wage. And that's, many people consider that a violation of basic rights. Now, we're moving close to the end of our study guide here. We had some special lecture in class on the ascendancy of the alt-right and people like Steve Bannon. One of the questions that came up in the lecture was how the founding father of conservatism, Edmund Burke, would potentially regard, if he was alive today, how would he regard the alt-right's claims about the nature of the U.S. lowercase c Constitution. And to understand the different ways to interpret Burke, you have to go back to his foundational remarks on the French Revolution. And we said that he was highly critical of the French Revolution because it sort of was too experimental. It was an extreme experiment with society that didn't take into consideration the social values, the cultural, the importance of culture as a sort of a stabilizing role in society, in French society. So by trying to sort of erase culture, French culture, overnight, and trying to change French society overnight, you can end up losing the basic everyday values of politeness and decency that allow a society to sort of that allow a society to pull basic stuff, to maintain basic stability, to maintain basic decency. So Burke saw the French Revolution as a disaster in that sense, because there was so much bloodshed and values that had previously kept people kind of polite and civilized to each other, had just gone out the window, all in the name of this social experiment. It was from outsiders' perspective, it just looked like a completely unnecessary adventure or experiment in social engineering. Another really important question that I think we discussed in class was John Trumbull's 1816 painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I argued that the painting had a kind of ambivalent relationship to the truth, insofar as what it chose to say and what it forgot to say kind of can be seen as a metaphor of contemporary alt-right views on whether the U.S. has this mythical English Protestant constitution. The Trumbull painting has a bunch of white men, the founding fathers, in their powdered wigs, sitting back in repose, pondering what they're going to put in the Declaration of Independence, and looking very relaxed and looking very philosophical. And of course, what's not said in the painting is that the country, the labor that made that painting possible, that made those powdered wigs and that comfortable repose possible, came from women, came from African American slaves, and would have been impossible without the outright stealing of land from the Native Americans who lived there before these guys ever came over. So, to sort of say that somehow the United States was founded from a blank sheet of paper by this English Protestant cultural tradition ignores the other sacrifices that had to be made in order for the U.S. Constitution to come into existence and the Declaration of Independence to come into existence. So, in that sense, we can apply our discussion of this painting to some of the alt-right conversation today, which seems to sort of desire or yearn for an ethnic purity, a racial purity in America, because it poses this idea that somehow the real America is an America that cracks down on immigrants, that is for people of a certain cultural esteem, and in fact, the nation has always been a nation of illegal immigrants forever, and without illegal immigration, you wouldn't have any of the labor that allows these wealthy elite people to have their comfortable lifestyles. So America, in a sense, is a kind of a paradox. We often wonder today about immigrants, stealing our jobs is something you hear a lot. But of course, immigrants also create jobs, right? They make money, they spend money. That money, the goods and services they spend their money on have to be made by someone. So, economists tell us that, many studies have been carried out on this, that immigration creates wealth. It doesn't actually take jobs, it makes jobs. It's very convenient for politicians to repeat this argument over and over, that immigrants steal our jobs, but the truth of the matter is that immigrants rarely steal jobs. Usually they do jobs that no one else wants to do, or they, in their consumption of goods and services at local stores, they actually increase consumption and generate taxation revenue at the point of sale for the government, for the state government, for the federal government. So, sales tax is a really important part of what keeps our hospitals and our roads and our schools going. So, in that sense, just from an economically self-interested perspective, forget about the ethics, of giving a warm welcome to immigrants. No one's saying you have to like them, but certainly this argument about them stealing our jobs is quite arguably choice. And I think that's kind of the background condition of our discussion of the John Trumbull painting, is that there's a lot of labor that goes on when people come to this country. They do not have the luxury of welfare. They don't have the luxury of claiming benefits. They are not wined and dined as sometimes our politicians represent them to be. Usually they're standing in the line on the street corner waiting for part-time work, piecemeal labor work, day labor, go and work in gardens, go and work in building sites, go and work as nannies in our cleaners in many of our factories and institutions. If those people suddenly had to go, who would do those jobs? That's a really interesting question. We talked a lot in class about dog whistling, so I'm not going to get back into that again. But we did have some questions and some conversation about foreign policy in the course, and so one thing I think I could have emphasized a bit better. We kind of wrapped up a little early that day, and the central ideological principle of George Bush's national security doctrine was that you kind of needed to go to war before you saw the smoking gun in the shape of a mushroom cloud. This was something that Condoleezza Rice and Dick Cheney were repeating over and over again, based on their heartfelt views that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And the interesting thing about that is those heartfelt views weren't exactly grounded in fact, because there were many people, including Ambassador Joe Wilson, who famously, went to Niger on a mission sent by the White House, by the way, to see if the alleged yellow cake uranium that Iraq had been trying to get its hands on in order to weaponize it and turn it into a dirty bomb had actually ever gone to Iraq. And he came back and saying, there's documents there, but they're total forgeries, and there's no reason to think that Iraq has gotten its hands on anything like this. So that's the danger of a preemptive policy, a policy of preemptive war, is that the threats that you were assuming are there may not be there. And it's we didn't really get into this in class, but as a bit of background to it, I can tell you that there's a lot of documentation now to the effect that, including from the British, that there was there's a pretty much consensus on this. I think that Condoleezza Rice and Cheney and Bush knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that they were kind of conjuring up this idea, and that's been argued, I think, at length, both in U.S. inquiries, but also very, very much so in recent inquiries that have happened in Britain. And if you want more information on that, you should look up something called the Chilcot Report, which was a major study carried out by the British government to try to understand what had happened after 9/11 and why British forces ended up going into war in Iraq and not finding any weapons of mass destruction there at all, because of course it was very expensive and possibly unnecessary, arguably, in fact, unnecessary. So last question then, in terms of foreign policy, what is unilateralism? Again, it's a kind of an aspect that many people associate with the Bush administration. The United States typically, if it goes into a foreign country, wants to do so with a bunch of allies in order to give its intervention some moral standing. The US did manage to put together a small number of allies with very small contingents of troops committed to the cause, and nominally had the support of NATO to going into Iraq. But compared to, say, for example, George Bush Sr.'s action in the first Gulf War, where there was a very, very serious constellation of allies put together to roll Saddam Hussein back out of Kuwait, the decision to go into Iraq is seen very much as a unilateral decision, and the fig leaf of the small number of allies that it had and the small, very small contingents of forces that they contributed, which were really very cosmetic in nature most of the time, with the exception of maybe some small elite forces from Poland and some infantry from Great Britain. Really, there wasn't a lot. Really, it was an American operation. 99%. So now, mystery question, guys. It's Christmas time. I just wanted to put in a mystery question. Don't lose your socks over this one. We'll have some fun in the exam. That's all. Okay, so that's about it from me. I hope this study guide was helpful, and I will see. I know some of you are going to come by on Thursday to pick up your journals. I look forward to seeing you then. Okay, thanks, guys. Bye-bye.